Welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. Today, I'm speaking to Head of Research and Innovation at Western Bulldogs and Victoria University, Sam Robertson. Thanks for tuning in to episode 168 of the Pacey Performance Podcast. So, really excited to bring you this episode with Sam Robertson. So, I wanted to get Sam on because of his work with the Western Bulldogs and Victoria University and how he pulls that together in his role as the Head of Research and Innovation at both establishments. So in this episode we discuss lots of things, and two things that really stand out for me are the aspects that we speak about on machine learning and how that can be used in a practical and applied setting, and also Sam's views on RPE, which gets a little bit controversial, but also his views on prediction and the kind of controversy around certain companies claiming or certain people claiming that can be done for a multitude of things, from injury to training load to potential future performance. So we discuss all the intricacies and some ethical issues around that kind of thing. So it was a superb episode with Sam, and I really appreciate him giving up his time in the first couple of days of his holiday over Christmas.
So if we look at and try and fit a model or some kind of ANOVA or even a basic t-test to a phenomena where we're trying to look at whether A is related to B, if you're using a traditional statistical approach and there is a non-linear relationship between A and B, your statistical approach will tell you that is not a good model, or it is poor, or there is no relationship. Whereas in reality, you're actually just limited by the tools that you have at your disposal.
So just before we do get into the chat with Sam, I want to say a big thanks to Vald Performance, makers of the Nordboard, groin bar and all new Human Track. So if you are interested in learning a bit more about Vald Performance and the three bits of kit that they offer, head over to valdperformance.com or follow them on Twitter at valdperformance. So also sponsoring this episode today is ForceDecks. So if you are looking for a force plate hardware and software solution, please check them guys out. They're at forcedecks.com. And I would also encourage you to check out episode 139 of the podcast. So that's strengthofscience.com/139. And that is with co-owner of ForceDecks, Dr. Daniel Cohen. And it's certainly not a sales pitch for ForceDecks, but Daniel goes into a lot of detail with regards to jump monitoring. So if you are one of them guys out there that does or is interested in jump monitoring, wants to know a little bit more about the intricacies around it, have a little look at episode 139, and I'm sure that will give you tons of value. So over to the podcast with Sam. Hope you enjoy, and as always, I would love your feedback. Thanks for tuning in to the Pacey Performance Podcast. So this afternoon, I'm delighted to welcome Sam Robertson, who is the Head of Research and Innovation at Western Bulldogs and Victoria University. So welcome to the podcast, Sam.
Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
That's a problem, mate. Thanks for giving up your first day of your holiday to have a little chat.
No problems.
Anyone that doesn't know who you are, just want to give us a little bit of background on yourself and what you're currently doing.
Yeah, so essentially I look after the partnership that the Victoria University in Australia has with the Western Bulldogs, which is one of the Australian Football League clubs. I've been in that role for about 4 years. It's probably changed a little bit each year, but as the title would suggest, I essentially look after the research that we undertake at the club, in particular also supervising PhD students and other staff that we have there. And of course, I also work really closely with the management around, initially identifying innovative ideas that we can potentially consider for innovation or implementation around the club, and then start to roll those out, which is really exciting. I'm really fortunate.
Nice. So what did you do before the two roles?
I've worked a little bit in academia, at other universities in Australia. And I've also worked in applied sport, so in institutes of sport around the UK, in Europe and Australia, largely in a variety of sports actually. Golf was actually my main sport before moving into Australian rules football, but really it's been Australian rules football for the better part of 8 or 9 years now. But yeah, I guess if you consider someone sitting right in the middle of academia and applied sport, I guess that would be myself. I've kind of gone back and forward over the years, and now again really fortunate to be able to kind of sit in both camps at the same time, which is great.
Nice. So where were you in the UK? I may have asked you this before.
Well, again, it's largely golf was my first dalliance into the UK. There's a lot of consulting as well, some to institutes of sport, but again, quite multi-sport rather than football or anything. I've never worked in football or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. And the PhD students that you get out of at the university, are they based with you in the club, and they've got the kind of applied research kind of roles?
Yeah, essentially we put time and effort into a range of areas. We're quite, when you think of sports science, we're quite broad. We also include things relating to list management and recruiting and scouting in that area. We do probably a little bit more with coaching than the typical sports science program as well. And again, depending on the nature of that project, the student may be working at the club every day at every training session. For example, if one of the students is based in GPS, whereas others that may be working, say, in the analytics space, they may spend a really small proportion of time at the club. So we have about 6 at the moment that are working across different areas. So it really does depend on their project and their topic and the nature of how they plug into the program.
Mm-hmm. So when the questions that they are answering for their research, for the research purposes, is that directed by the club, or is it directed by the uni, or a bit of both?
No, we really pride ourselves on trying to answer questions that the club has identified as a priority, and certainly I work fairly closely with the club to identify those areas that are, I guess, perceived as a priority, and also that are actually worth spending time on, that we think we can actually get an applied outcome for. So having said all that, when we do identify the student, we also work with them to make sure that the topic is reflecting their interests. But yeah, I mean, primarily we're trying to identify questions that the club sees as beneficial in helping them then win more games and win more premierships.
Mm-hmm. Sweet. So I had a little bit of stalking over the last couple of weeks, which is kind of normal for me, and listening to your podcast, I think 2015 or 2016 with Mladen, and then that led me on to a conference presentation that you did pretty more recently. Was it in the Far East, Japan, China, something like that?
That's a good question. There's been a few this year, so I'm not sure if it's over in China, but I don't think I've been to China this year. But yeah, there's been a couple in the Middle East and New Zealand and Australia and Europe and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, ultimately they tend to be on a similar theme, which I'm sure we'll talk about over the next little while, but around analytics in sport and so yeah, it's a growing field, it's a growing topic, and there's a lot of interest in it.
Nice. Yeah, and obviously I think it was an hour and a half, so it was really good, really enjoyed it. And one thing that I've kind of been exposed to a little bit more than I thought I would is the kind of pure analytics side of things at Catapult, and the machine learning side of things, and trying to get educated a little bit from our data scientists there. But and it's really intrigued me. I'd love to get your kind of thoughts on what it is, and then how it is actually applied in your roles at the university and the football club.
Sure. I mean, it's. I think as you'll be aware, it's an overused term. There's probably better understanding of what machine learning entails than there has been in the past. But essentially, in a broad sense, we're talking about providing a computer an ability to learn without it being programmed. So there's a number of reasons why machine learning would be used and how it actually works, and particularly why it might be useful in sport. So the idea of machine learning as opposed to, say, parametric statistics is that it has this ability to handle nonlinearity and dynamic phenomena that we experience in sport. And I think that most of us that have worked or have an understanding of elite sport will understand that these types of phenomena are really common. And if we don't account for them in some way with our analysis, then we're either going to make incorrect inferences or we're going to miss something altogether. And so by its very nature, machine learning has the ability to account for this. And there's different families of algorithms that sit within machine learning. And so we have, relationship modeling, which essentially we would consider potentially as prediction. We have rule-based approaches. We have unsupervised analysis approaches like clustering, which I'm sure some of the listeners are familiar with. There's different families of algorithms. So the element of the computer being able to learn without it being explicitly programmed, which is essentially the main power of machine learning, is not something that we really need it for, I suppose, in elite sport. We don't really have big enough data sets. That's changing, particularly with the volume of unstructured data we're dealing with, particularly which is derived from vision and to a lesser extent sensors. But the main advantage is mapping that nonlinear phenomena, as I've already mentioned, and also probably just some of the things that are really important from an applied perspective, like understanding complexity, removing redundancies from data, which of course in turn improves the efficiency of workflow of people working in the field. So, but again, when I publish and when others publish using machine learning in the literature, it tends to be more based around this notion that, hey, have a look at machine learning, have a look at how by understanding this dynamic nature of our data, we can better understand what's happening in sport. So it's more used for that rather than I guess reducing computational time, which is maybe what it's used for more in pure data science.
So for someone that is out in the field and a department, a couple of guys, maybe wearing GPS and collecting a little bit of data here and there, is it something that they should be kind of reading up on and getting into, or is this something that's kind of far down the line for these kind of guys in the field?
It's a fascinating question. I do get asked this a lot. It's to have an understanding of machine learning is not particularly difficult, and I would certainly encourage any of the listeners to do so. As a philosophy of thinking, it's obviously entwined with different theoretical frameworks that are available in literature to us, things like dynamical systems, for example, or complexity, or any kind of complexity theory. So I think for the people that I have worked with over the years, or colleagues that have developed an understanding of this area, it has changed their philosophy and the way that they view data, and the way that they also view just about everything they undertake in elite sports. So at a bare minimum, yes, I think it's important for people to understand. From a level of developing programming skills and being able to understand and run the analysis itself, I think someone coming from a sports science background, it's a difficult area to address. It's going to take probably years rather than months to develop that skill set. Having said that, we're really fortunate at the Bulldogs. We have some staff and students that have basically done that. They've come from a sports science background and have developed those skill sets, and that makes them extremely valuable people in the field, to clubs and to universities for that matter. And of course, the other approach is that some clubs and universities have also done is actually go the other way and bring people straight in from statistics or from data science or computer science and bring them into the sporting environment. So, yeah, I guess if people out there with a sports science background are really seeing a need for that in their research or their workflow, it's worth doing, but it's certainly not something you're going to pick up overnight.
So the guys that you've spoken to who have got into it and it's changed their perception on how they look at data? In what way? I know this is third hand, but be interesting to know if you do.
Yeah, I think it comes back to what I mentioned earlier around traditional parametric statistics. So if we look at and try and fit a model or some kind of ANOVA or even a basic t-test to a phenomena where we're trying to look at whether A is related to B, if you're using a traditional statistical approach and there is a non-linear relationship between A and B, your statistical approach will tell you that that is not a good model, or it is poor, or there is no relationship. Whereas in reality, you're actually just limited by the tools that you have at your disposal. And so essentially you're making an inference there is no relationship between two variables, where in fact there is a relationship. You're just not able to understand it because the tools that you have at your disposal are too crude to be able to understand that. So as you can imagine, as a way of thinking, that completely transforms the way that you just about look at every data set, because you go from a situation where you're discarding information or discarding data that may actually be really important. And so I've seen it, a number of times with people. Their default position changes from one of linearity to non-linearity straight away. And of course, that's really useful because it helps you to understand that all these different concepts that we talk about a lot in sport now, like the concept of individual differences, and both from an inter-individual and an intra-individual perspective, and also how different athletes will respond to in different ways to different stimuli. So it does transform the way people start to think, and and I'm sure we'll talk about later on just some examples of that in the literature, including some that my group's published around, for example, session RPE, how session RPE will change will change completely based on within individual and inter-individual differences around what's recorded in the GPS, for example.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was my next question, giving us some examples of how this kind of use of it can be used actually in the field, not just in the research.
Yeah, I think,
which I know is both for you.
Yeah, I think certainly machine learning has particularly been used in the literature to date around prediction. I think prediction is a concept that people tend to have I guess it's a sexy question. I think for people, people have wanted to predict things forever, really, and so almost always machine learning will provide a better prediction than a linear statistical approach. Almost always, and that's because it's able to account for that non-linearity. And so I think if you can think about any kind of prediction-based problem that people are facing in sport, then it could be of use. And I guess injury is the main one that comes to mind. And there's been a number of attempts to do that in the literature, and I'm sure we'll talk about this at some point as well. But I've already mentioned the session RPE as another example. But I suppose the other predominant one that you'll see in the literature and in the field for that matter is predicting outcomes, in particular of either contests or matches or in elite sport, in particular in team sport. So, I think anything where you can consider there needing to be predicting something, whether it's an outcome, an injury, or the best kind of team lineup for a match, anything like that can be addressed using machine learning.
So while we're on the topic of RPE, and you brought up a couple of times in that conference presentation that I mentioned, it came up, I think, in one of the questions at the end about RPE, maybe, and your skepticism around it. Is that a good word, skepticism? Do you just want to explain why? Yeah,
I mean, I guess I am skeptical by nature about a number of things. Probably more for session RPE. It's less around my skepticism around it as a measure, and more around myself and probably others as well, holding us to account in sports science of being holding us to account of being better. And I think without being overly critical of work that gets done in the field, I think session RPE is something that certainly for lower levels of sport where there's no other measures available, or it's particularly no other cost-effective measures, it's really useful. But I think as an industry we need to be moving beyond this, and we certainly have tools at our disposal in sub-elite or elite sport, which mean that this is not really something that we should continue to use. We have far better measures available. This is a very crude measure. Yes, there's the literature supporting it. We've used it for a long time, but things have moved very, very quickly with respect to technology, with respect to our understanding of how people respond to exercise and training, and yet. And there's plenty of research out there that's really questioning its validity and reliability as well. So I guess it's more around holding us account in sports science to do things better, and because we have the ability to do it. And I don't think we should look back at things that we did 10, 20, 30 years ago as necessarily being wrong. We just need to progress, and we need to continue to aim high and do things better. And I guess the last thing around session RPE is I certainly haven't met a team sport athlete that likes providing it every day. And so, I think a lot of what we do particularly at the Bulldogs as well is a real emphasis on not just the measurement properties and the measurement quality of things that we collect around validity and reliability, for example, but also this concept of feasibility. How much does it cost? How long does it take to obtain a certain measure? And then, more importantly of all, really, does the athlete engage in it? Do they buy into it? Do they like providing that? Or is there a burden associated with them providing it? And we feel there's better ways of collecting that without placing unnecessary burden on the athlete.
So you still do collect it at the Bulldogs?
No, we don't. No.
Okay. When did that? Was there a turning point where you thought this isn't worth it, or it's never been on the cards at the Bulldogs?
It's and it's a paper I wrote with some really good colleagues from Deakin University a couple of years ago on this. Around 20 different items that really can be used as a framework to determine whether a measure, or not whether a measure is high quality or not, but to determine the quality of a particular measure. And as I just mentioned, feasibility was something that we added to that framework, which traditionally hasn't been considered in I guess, measurement theory. And when we hold up things that we collect, particularly in a routine sense in applied sport, that particular measure didn't hold up to scrutiny. It wasn't providing us useful information from a prediction perspective. It wasn't really strongly associated with a lot of our other load measures. The athletes didn't like providing it, and so when you come to that point, it's very difficult to provide an argument about why you should continue to maintain collecting it. And certainly, I'm only speaking for us at the Bulldogs. I can't, and I want to stress that I'm not saying it's not going to be the pick on session RPE session, but we certainly, for us, that's an example of one where we felt we could get better information elsewhere in a non-invasive sense that was not burdening staff or the athlete. And I won't go into detail with what those measures were, but that's just an example of one, and it wasn't the only one. So that's something we regularly revisit not every year, but probably even more regularly than that. And I think it's really healthy practice for any sporting organisation.
Again, that leads me on to what I was going to say, was obviously that applies to you guys, the Bulldogs, but how would someone, lesser organisation, less, resources, is that kind of in-depth look doable? And what's the process you'd go about, you would undertake to go about what you think is useful in your environment? Again,
short of turning this into shameless self-promotion, I think I would get a hold of that paper I referred to earlier, and maybe we can drop that into the end of the podcast with I'll dig it up as we talk, the title. But essentially that was the motivation for undertaking that paper, that we could provide a framework for practitioners to go through particular measures and basically choose which one holds up best to scrutiny. And again, if the practitioner or the sporting organisation or environment is not equipped to systematically evaluate the measures, then that's fine. I mean, it can certainly be done based on the existing literature. But again, we'd see that as for example, there might be 4 or 5 load measures that you're collecting. You might want to reduce that. And so this tool or framework can be used to precisely do that. It's not just based around data redundancy, about removing inefficiencies, but that's one part of it. It's also about choosing the best measure that's going to provide you with the most precise and informative information that can help you make better decisions with your athletes. And so, of course, if you're improving your efficiencies and improving your accuracy and precision of what you're doing, that's what it's all about. So I would encourage practitioners to get a hold of that, because that's precisely why we did